All right, let's talk about what's going on in Washington, D.C. There's a funding crisis brewing, but it's probably not the one you're thinking of. We are right on the verge of a shutdown, but one that targets a very specific, very critical part of the U.S. government. So let's break down exactly what's happening, why it's happening right now, and what it means for all of us.
So, if you just glanced at the headlines, you might think everything's fine. I mean, after a pretty brief shutdown at the end of January, Congress and the president actually managed to fund the vast majority of federal agencies. But here's the twist. That deal deliberately left one crucial department, just 5% of the government, on a total knife's edge, with its funding set to basically evaporate in just a few days.
So how did we even get here? Well, a partial shutdown kicked off on January 31st. It ended just a few days later on February 3rd. But the very bill that fixed that crisis created a brand new, incredibly urgent deadline, Friday, February 13th. And that deadline, it applies only to the Department of Homeland Security.
So yeah, in the process of ending one big, widespread crisis, they immediately triggered another one. This time, it's way more focused. A solution for most of the government created a massive problem for a critical few, and believe me, it was completely by design.
You really have to look at the fine print of that February 3rd deal. It gives stable, long-term funding for most agencies. Defense, labor, transportation, they're all set until September. But, and this is the big but, the Department of Homeland Security was deliberately separated and given just a short-term patch. It's called a continuing resolution. And that patch runs out at midnight this Friday. So why single out Homeland Security? This isn't just about budget numbers. Nope. This is a high-stakes political fight over policy and accountability. And it's a fight that was kicked off by a really tragic, high-profile incident just a few weeks ago.
It all comes back to one event, the fatal shooting of Alex Pretty by Customs and Border Protection agents in Minneapolis on January 24th. This event completely galvanized Democrats, who pretty much immediately said they would not support any long-term funding for DHS without some major reforms to its law enforcement agencies.
And that brings us right to the heart of the standoff. On one side, Democrats see this must-pass funding bill as their biggest point of leverage. They're demanding it includes a set of 10 guardrail reforms to get more accountability for agencies like ICE. On the other side, Republicans are flat-out rejecting putting policy changes in a funding bill. They're framing the demands as an attempt to hamstring federal agents and, in their words, to defund law enforcement. So what are these guardrails they're talking about? Well, the demands are very specific. We're talking about things like requiring a judicial warrant to enter private property, banning federal agents from wearing masks, making sure officers have visible ID numbers on their uniforms, and requiring body cameras. So you can see, this is not a simple budget squabble. It's a fundamental fight over how these powerful agencies should be allowed to operate. Okay, so while all that political drama is playing out, there's a whole other crisis happening in the background. That short shutdown back in January had a huge ripple effect on the economy. It delayed critical data releases and basically left financial markets and policymakers, well, flying blind. And you can see the direct impact right here. The super important monthly jobs report, that was supposed to come out last Friday, but it got pushed to this Wednesday. And the key inflation number, the CPI, got moved from this Wednesday to this coming Friday, the exact same day that DHS funding is set to run out. And this quote really says it all. Without this steady flow of data, it's way harder for the Federal Reserve to make decisions on interest rates, and Wall Street is left dealing with a ton of uncertainty. This isn't just some inconvenience, it creates real volatility for everything from mortgage rates to the stock market. So here's the bottom line. This whole thing comes to a head this Friday. We are literally looking at a perfect storm where two separate, major national events, one political, one economic, are now on a collision course for the exact same day. And that creates a massive amount of risk. First up, you have the political crisis. The absolute drop-dead deadline for Congress to fund the Department of Homeland Security is midnight. If they fail, hundreds of thousands of federal employees are affected, and key security operations are thrown into chaos. And then, just hours before that political deadline, at 8:30 in the morning, that delayed inflation data is set to drop. It is shaping up to be a day that could rattle both Washington and Wall Street, one right after the other. So what does this actually mean in practical terms? Let's get really clear on which government services are totally secure and which ones are at risk of shutting down this Friday if a deal doesn't get done. Okay, on the safe side, we've got the military, Social Security, national parks, and Veterans Affairs. They're all fully funded through September. No worries there. But on the at-risk side, it's all the agencies under Homeland Security. That means the TSA agents at the airport, the Border Patrol, disaster response from FEMA, and even the Coast Guard. And this is where the real human cost of this standoff comes in. Many of these at-risk employees are considered essential personnel. What that means is, even if a shutdown happens, they are legally required to show up for work, but they will not get a paycheck until the shutdown is over. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of families suddenly facing huge financial uncertainty. You know, to really get what the end game is here, you only need to know two terms. Right now, DHS is on a continuing resolution, or CR. Think of it as a temporary Band-Aid. The goal for everybody is an appropriations bill. That's the long-term funding law that gives them certainty. But they are completely deadlocked on the policy changes needed to get from the Band-Aid to the real solution.
And that leaves us with this one central question, doesn't it? This whole situation is about using a must-pass funding bill as leverage to get major policy changes. It really forces us to ask, at what point does that strategy stop being a negotiation and start becoming a self-inflicted crisis?